Good afternoon, everyone that's already joined the call. I'm just waiting. I'm just watching a few other people enter the meeting room right now, so we're just waiting. I'll just wait one more minute and then we'll begin.
Okay, good afternoon, David.
Good afternoon. Okay, so I do have 1 o'clock, a bit past one, just in the interest of everyone's time. We will begin. Again, good afternoon, everyone. My name is David Walls. I've been teaching this particular module, health and safety, for the last maybe 9 years, 10 years. As I understand, it is the final module for everyone taking the 5 modules for the CPC program. So you made it this far. Congratulations. The module today, it's a little dense. We do go through a lot of information. I just want to preface that for everyone. And there's really no way around it. Unfortunately, health and safety is one of those topics where we do have to get through a lot of information. The good news is we will ensure that we cover all the information you will need to be successful as you write the CPC exam. Generally, it'll probably take about 2.5 hours to get through. We will take a break halfway through, just to get up and stretch, go get a coffee, take a 5-minute break, and then we'll proceed and finish up the remainder of the session today. So as we go through, I'm going to turn off my video. I do find it kind of distracting just for my own purpose as we're going through the slides. But we will share the slides momentarily. We will get started. So as we've discussed, this is the health and safety module. One of the good parts about being last is we don't have to go through these items again. You've already done the previous 4 modules, most likely, and your result will be the CPC exam. Now, my qualifications, I've been doing health and safety specifically in the temporary employment world for about 19 years now. So I've been doing it at a national level. Again, I've been teaching this course for about 9 or 10 years approximately. And I think the benefit for the CPC program, specifically for people in the temporary employment world, is that the program itself is taught by people who've been in the program. It's built for the temporary employment world. It really delves into some of the nuances that we have, some of the challenges that we have. And especially when it comes to something like health and safety, we do have a very difficult time sometimes because we are dealing with our employees who we're responsible for. We're dealing with the government, who we do have legislative requirements to adhere to. And we're dealing with clients where the employees are actually sent to. So I find, at least from our case and the company that I work for, the CPC program has been very beneficial. It's allowed us to really help some of our staff members get involved and learn the nuances of the industry itself. So I would imagine you've gone through the mission statement already. We can skip that area. Code of ethics, same thing. Now, what are we going to be doing today? We're going to be, again, very dense subject today. I do apologize, but health and safety is a very big component, very wide-reaching, and it basically encroaches on essentially every business aspect that we have. At the end of today, though, we're going to take a look at making sure that we all understand and are able to demonstrate some knowledge and skills regarding the number of legislation and regulations, including the Occupational Health and Safety Act, WHMIS, critical injuries, designated substances, and first aid. We're going to want to understand knowledge of the responsibilities and regulations under appropriate and applicable provincial compensation acts. We're going to take a look at what basic injury, illness reporting requirements are, and we're going to, as a group, commit to upholding all components of health and safety as it pertains to recruiters, employers, employees, candidates, and applicants. Some of the topics we are going to be discussing today, we're going to be looking at safety principles and risk management. We're going to be delving into some legislation, some defined or highlighted areas of legislation that apply to our industry specifically, as well as collectively. We're going to be looking at rights and responsibilities of managers, supervisors, and workers. We're going to be taking a deep look at hazard recognition and control measures, hazards and control measures for chemical, physical, and biological hazards. We'll be taking a look at workplace inspections, accident investigations, and hopefully developing a framework for some understanding on what it takes to have an effective workplace health and safety program. Upon completion of the course, we should be able to find applicable occupational health and safety legislation. It's not always so important to know the legislation in or out. I mean, the important thing is to know, okay, when this applies, where do I find it? And how do I find it? And do I have a baseline knowledge of what it means? We're going to want to know our health and safety responsibilities. We're going to want to determine ways of meeting those responsibilities, both as an individual and as a corporate entity operating in this world. We're going to be looking at identifying hazards and develop safe work practices. We are going to want to take leadership in developing and implementing an occupational health and safety program. And lastly, we're going to want to understand what the consequences of non-compliance with the Workplace Safety Insurance Act, with some of the other provincial compensation acts are, as well as the government's legislative occupational health and safety acts. The Occupational Health and Safety Act, we're going to get into this. Employers, managers, supervisors, workers, and the government all have responsibilities when it comes to workplace health and safety. Additionally, workers have the right to refuse unsafe work, participate in health and safety activities, and know about dangers in the workplace. And those are essentially known as the 3 basic rights. We will get into those specifically on some subsequent slides. One of the items with this presentation today is we are going to be looking at a number of case studies, approximately 4 or 5 case studies. And the way it's going to work today is I'm going to read what the case study is, and we're going to have about 2-3 minutes. What I ask everyone to do is respond in the chat function what your answer may be. As we go through, I'll prompt you to do that. And then afterwards, we will discuss some of the answers, and pose any questions you may have, as well as just go through it. So that being said, the first case study was regarding an incident in Saskatchewan in 2015. And the backstory of this is there was an 18-year-old worker who had been on the job for 6 or 7 hours. He fell at least 20 feet and broke his wrist and 2 vertebrae. He'd been working on roof trusses that were 20 to 25 feet off the ground. He had not received any training, and there was no fall protection equipment provided. The customer tried to blame the worker's fall on his untied boots. Now, the question is let's pretend you work for the company that placed this worker. I'd like everyone to take a moment and note something that we could have done to prevent this event from happening. So I'm going to ask everyone, just take a moment, think about it, and provide your answer in the chat function, and we will review. So the question is, what would you have done to prevent this as an incident at your work? So far we have one answer. Anyone else? Can anyone else contribute to what the question may be? All right, we're starting to come in now. Very good. So the first one that came in is make sure the worker is aware of the hazards through training. Ensure that controls are in place. Absolutely, Leanne, that's a great answer. That is something that is the bedrock of a health and safety program. Understand what the hazards are, train for the hazards themselves. Got another one, receive training and have protection equipment. Again, very good answer, the training, as well as we're adding protection equipment, especially when you're working at heights, which this person was working at least 20, 25 feet off the ground. PPE for this is not only good practice, it is required by law in every jurisdiction in Canada. Whitney wrote a site tour of customers before placing candidates. Absolutely. Site tour of the customer is a very valid point, making sure you understand what it is the workers you are supplying to that work site are going to be doing. It's well and good to be speaking with the customer, but it is even more important, especially if you are faced with a critical injury, like in this case, where this person has had a very serious injury. In this case, the government is going to get involved, whether it be a labor inspector or occupational health and safety inspector. They're going to be required to be called for this, and they will investigate. So absolutely. Training fall protection, working at heights, absolutely. That is a requirement. So any sort of work over 10 feet in height in every jurisdiction requires both training as well as the practical fall protection and fall prevention. Proper equipment, again, training. So the key takeaway here is training, and I absolutely agree. The thing that stood out for me was had no training. So I think we've identified that. The one item that no one really picked up on is that this employee was 18 years old. And we have a special sort of requirement for, especially anyone operating in Ontario. New and young workers has been a focus of the Ontario government in terms of health and safety for the last 10 years, 12 years perhaps. Every single time around the beginning of summer, when university students come in, and a lot of them do come to our offices and seek summer employment, we have a special sort of requirement to assist with new and young workers. And what does that mean? Young workers are workers generally between or under 25 years old. And new workers are people who are new to the Canadian environment. They may be from another country, they may have never had a job previously, but they are new to the workforce. They don't have the same sort of understanding, training, education, and experience with working in this sort of environment. So some of the items we've also looked at, we looked at the training, we looked at the hazards, we looked at the site inspection. All those are great items. I mean, ultimately, if we take a look at this from our perspective, we should have never provided staff to this customer because we know that no training was provided, no safety equipment was provided. There was no sort of adherence to what the law is with regards to working at heights, as well as fall protection and equipment. So ultimately, based on this, we would not have provided workers to this work site. So we're going to take a look at OSHA and regulations. So OSHA is the Occupational Health and Safety Act, and it is the definition of what the act is in Ontario. So I just want to draw people's attention. A lot of the terminology used in this training today will be very specific to Ontario in terms of what it's labeled as. If you are from a different province, however, you will have a very similar sort of thing. It just may be called Health and Safety Act or Safety Act or something similar to that. In Ontario, it's called the Occupational Health and Safety Act, as well as regulations. So we know that the occupational health and safety legislation in Canada aligns the general rights and responsibilities of the employer, supervisor, and the worker. And it contains information on WHMIS, critical injury, designated substances, industrial establishments, and first aid. And the reason I draw your attention to the differences, but we have to understand in Ontario, or in Canada rather, there are 14 specific jurisdictions. There's one federal jurisdiction, there's 10 provincial, and there's 3 territorial, and each has their own occupational health and safety legislation. Why does this apply to us? If your company operates multi-jurisdictionally, so if you operate, say, in Ontario and Quebec, you need to be aware of where the placement is, because that is going to dictate what occupational health safety legislation is applicable. If you're operating in Ontario, you have to abide by the Ontario rules. If you're operating in Quebec or Alberta or Saskatchewan or PEI, you have to operate within the rules of where that person is placed. If you have someone that is working at a federal legislated company, that is a different sort of thing. So even if they're operating in Ontario, but the client themselves are federally regulated, you are going to have to make sure that the protocols you follow adhere to the federal legislation. It doesn't matter that you as the agency is provincially regulated, because they are placed at a federally regulated company, you have to adhere to that legislation. So the question you want to ask, is your client federal or provincially regulated? In 90% of the cases, they're going to be provincially regulated. So only approximately 10% of the Canadian workforce falls under a federally regulated workplace. And what does that mean? It essentially means that any sort of work that transverses or traverses across provincial barriers. So you'd be talking about things like the federal government would be one, airports, banks, ferries, tunnels, bridges, radio, television broadcasting, grain elevators, feed mills, any sort of highway transports of transport drivers, truck drivers, pipelines, railways, shipping and shipping services, telephone and telegraph systems. So each one of those industries, you know, generally they work across Canada. So they operate throughout, you're going to be crossing through different provinces in the case of, let's say, a transport driver. And for the most part, those clients would be federally regulated. The important thing for you to understand is if you are operating or you are starting new business with a client and they operate in one of those workplaces that I just mentioned, you are going to want to ask them if they're provincially or federally regulated, because that is going to change what you adhere in terms of training, as well as some of your employment documents for employees being assigned to that customer. So again, it's not to say this is going to be very common for people, but you do want to make sure that if that is the case, you are being compliant with what the legislation for a federally regulated workplace is. What does OSA aim to do? To ensure employees' health and safety and well-being in the workplace, we want to encourage employees' participation in maintaining and improving health and safety. We want to prevent risks to health and safety in the workplace. We want to involve employees through representation on committees. We want to ensure that expert advice and resources are available to employees. Your role is going to be to participate in health and safety committees, providing ongoing education and awareness, onboard and train contract and temporary employees under their OSHA regulations, maintain and improve existing training opportunities, ensure on-site health and safety inspection reviews are done on a regular basis. So the idea is there are different roles. We will get into the different sort of players within the sphere where you have clients and government and you have us as well as employees. But just understand, we do want to concentrate on what the roles of each party is as we go through this today. So we have a multiple choice question. I'm going to read the question. Please answer in the chat box what you feel the best answer is. So I complete a workplace safety site inspection with every new customer prior to sending an employee out to work on the assignment. So that means, does your company do a site inspection on new clients when? You do it A, all the time, B, 90% of the time, C, half the time, when it can get out to the customer sites, D, usually after they start working, I would book time to go on site, or E, none of the time as my employee tells me whether it's safe or not. So let's take a minute, please record your answer in the chat and we'll discuss. So just looking at the chat function, overwhelmingly, everyone's chosen the answer B. So this is a good sort of temperature tester in the room of what sort of protocols people have in place at their particular company. So ACSESS is always supported for the last 2 decades, as long as I've known it, they have supported doing client site inspections. And what that means is going out to the client site and inspecting it and making sure that what the client is telling you is what is actually happening on the ground. You don't want to be sending people to client work inspection or client sites where they will be situated in unsafe work environments. We don't want people to get hurt. And later on, as we go through this course today, this module, we're going to be taking a look at what some of the repercussions are when someone does get hurt, financially, legislatively. It's not good in terms of the stigma associated with if you have workers seriously injured on the job. It is in our best interest to see the work environments that we're supplying workers to. So we're going to take a look at who is responsible for what. And as I mentioned a few moments ago, we essentially have 4 different parties within the work sphere. We have the workers, we have the customer, we have supervisors, and we have the staffing agency. So who is responsible for what? If you ask any one of these people, if you ask the customer, they will say the agency is responsible. If you ask the worker, they will say the customer or the agency is responsible. What it comes down to in terms of health and safety is a little different. Health and safety designates that everyone plays a key role in maintaining a safe work environment. And that's accomplished through training, through education, and through awareness, as well as the knowledge of what is expected of them in the role. Again, our industry has a unique relationship regarding health and safety where the intersection of the 4 parties, they have to come together for the overall protection of the workers. Health and safety legislation in no jurisdiction says it's just the customer, it's just the owner of the work site. They may have more responsibility, but if you're supplying workers to that work site, health and safety legislation does not differentiate between a full-time worker or a part-time worker, a temporary worker, a contract worker. All the parties are responsible for the health and safety of that work site if they are supplying, if they are doing any sort of work within that sphere. We want to make sure it's very clear on what each party is doing in terms of protecting worker safety. And that's truly where the site inspection comes into place. What you don't want is a misunderstanding on who is doing the training, who is providing the PPE for that person. You want to make sure it's understood between you and the customer, and then you can explain it as well to the workers themselves. So you can say, you know what, you're going to be doing this training with the staffing agency, with us, and then you're going to be going to the customer on the first day, you'll be doing some more site specific. The idea is you want to understand who is doing what. You want to make sure it's very clear. You want to make sure it's in writing. Ideally, you want to make sure it's part of your commercial contract with the client. Spell out who's doing what training, who's doing the wellness training, who's supplying the PPE. All those things are required to be done. And what you don't want is when there is, let's say, a major incident, a major accident, you don't want to be scrambling at that time to figure out, okay, no one actually did it because we weren't clear, we weren't concise, we didn't have it spelled out. We have another multiple choice. So who advises workers of hazards in the workplace, their specific role, and provides written instructions where prescribed? Is it the customer? Is it the worker? Is it the staffing agency? Or is it the supervisor? So please go ahead and record your answer. We'll take a look at, we'll discuss in a moment. So we have some people who've recorded the staffing agency. So the answer is C. Some people have recorded A as the customer being responsible for advising workers of hazards in the workplace. And this one's a bit of a curveball question. The answer is actually the supervisor. And the reason I say it's a curveball question, I'll get to in a second, but the person responsible and codified in legislation is the supervisor as being responsible of advising workers of hazards in the workplace and providing the instructions on how to deal with those hazards. The curveball in this is who's the supervisor? Is it the supervisor at the client? Is it the supervisor at the staffing agency? Or is it something else? The answer is the supervisor is both agency and client. The supervisor is required to do this directly with the worker. And the idea is both parties under occupational health and safety could be viewed as supervisors. So the supervisor at the client is providing instruction, disciplinary advice, and ensuring the work is being done safely. But the agency themselves, there would be someone most likely in your office that would be deemed by occupational health and safety to be a supervisor in this relationship. Make sure you're understanding, again, to the slide's previous point, you want to make sure that you understand and have come to an agreement on who will be doing what. Will the agency be doing it? Will the client be doing training, education, so forth? Having this in writing as part of the commercial contract is essential, just making sure you're covering all your bases. What are the responsibilities of our customers? We'll take a look at these. The customer is responsible for the equipment, materials, and protective devices that need to be provided, maintained, and used as prescribed in the workplace. There must be a copy of the OSA in the workplace. Generally, it's the little green book if you're here in Ontario. Most workplaces should have it. Responsible for information, instruction, and supervision to be provided to all workers. Customer must assign a competent person when selecting a supervisor. Customer must have in place a written, annually reviewed health and safety policy and program and have it posted and implemented in the workplace program. Customer has to take every precaution reasonable in all circumstances for the protection of workers. That is something, number 6, that the labor inspectors will typically use to charge an employer in an agency when something occurs. It is overtly broad, and it's overtly broad for a reason. It wants to cast a wide net. And some people will come back the first time they see this, they say, how can I take every reasonable precaution to ensure safety? There's a reason the legislation is broad. It is so that as an employer, you are constantly looking at all the hazards in the workplace and having protections put in place, whether it's engineering controls, it's education controls, it's personal protection controls. The answer is they do that for a reason, because their sole goal is to ensure that everyone is safe in the workplace. What are the responsibilities of the Joint Health and Safety Committee? Identify and evaluate workplace hazards, participate in programs to protect the employees' health and safety, be involved with employee complaints and suggestions concerning health and safety. So it's not a complacent role. They actually have to hear the complaints and you know, if it's deemed something needs to be done, they have to help action that sort of control or fix of the issue. They have to review injury and work hazard records, monitor and follow up hazard reports, and recommend action. Participate in safety and health inquiries, investigations, participate in resolving workplace refusals and work stoppages, make recommendations to management for incident prevention and safety programs, monitor effectiveness of safety programs and procedures. Now, in Ontario, once you get past 20 or more workers, there must be a joint health and safety committee in place. The important thing for our industry is to ensure that any sort of work that any client that you're supplying workers to, if they meet that or breach that, they have a joint health and safety committee in place, or if they have less than that, they have a safety representative in place. What are the responsibilities of the workplace supervisor? So this kind of harkens back to that previous slide. Workplace supervisor has some very big responsibilities in terms of employees at their workplace. They have to ensure that workers abide by the Act and the regulations and wear the prescribed PPE, equipment, and clothing. They also advise workers of hazards in the workplace. Their role provides written instruction where required. Supervisor takes every precaution reasonable in the circumstances for the protection of the worker. There's that idea again. Every precaution reasonable. And you're going to see that a lot throughout any sort of talk about legislation. What are the responsibilities of the agency? And interesting enough, as we look at this, we're going to see that they're very similar to that of the client. And essentially, as I referred to earlier, there's very little difference under occupational health and safety between the client and the customer in terms of the occupational health and safety requirements and responsibilities. So the agency has to provide required training to all workers under OSHA and Provincial Compensation Acts. So there's the training required in the education piece. Have to ensure that PPE devices, regardless of who's providing them, are worn, maintained, and used in the workplace where required. Have to ensure that the workers abide by the Act and the regulations and wears the prescribed PPEs, equipment, and clothing, provide required training on any of the prescribed PPEs, and they have to ensure a copy of OSHA is posted in the workplace. So if you recall in the previous slide, very, very similar to what the client responsibilities as well as the supervisor responsibilities at the client are. Again, very little difference between it in terms of health and safety legislation. And one of the other things, because there is a very sort of, little to no line between the responsibilities, you want to make sure that any specific training that is being done, that is required at that workplace, say something like, good manufacturing practices. If that's recorded at the workplace, you want to make sure that both the client and the agency has copies of that information. And that's sort of an agreement you want to come up to at the time of establishing a client as a new client. You want to make sure that that sort of information sharing is available and is a practice amongst you and the client themselves. You can't just fall back and say, oh, I thought the client was going to do it. That may not work in terms of if there is a major accident or incident in the workplace. So it's just a word of caution. So let's take a look at what the rights of the workers are. And the rights of workers are shared, with the exception Alberta has a slight nuance or change, but the basic premise of these three items is the same across every jurisdiction in Canada. Workers have these three basic rights. They have the right to know, the right to participate, and the right to refuse unsafe work. And that means all workers. It means temporary workers, it means contract workers, it means interns. Everyone, if they are considered a worker in that workplace, they are afforded these three basic rights. Usage of appropriate methods of communication for all employees should be maintained. So what that means is essentially that all employees should understand these rights. And we're going to take a look at some of the repercussions of this later on, but delving into what these three basic rights mean. Right to know essentially means that you have the right to know what hazards are present in the workplace, and you need to be given the information, training, and supervision you need to protect workers. So you need to know what's actually going on in the workplace. If there are specific chemicals being used, if there are allergens being used. And the example I always give is if you're working in a food manufacturing facility and you are going to be dealing with nut byproducts, you want to ensure that as you're supplying workers to that facility, you're informing workers of the presence of those, because people can have very serious sort of repercussions if they're exposed to nuts or if they're forced to work with it. You want to make sure at the beginning they know, they have the right to know about that sort of hazard in the workplace. The second right, the right to participate, it means that you have the right to participate in keeping the workplace healthy, safe, and it's generally afforded through the work of the Joint Health and Safety Program. So the workers are given a seat at the table in the Joint Health and Safety Committee to participate in the workplace, to ensuring that the workplace is a safe work environment. So it's not just management of the workplace dictating what the safety rules are, it is the cooperation between employees and management of the work to ensure the safety of the workplace. And lastly, one of the more tangent sort of rights is the right to refuse unsafe work. So every employee has the right to refuse unsafe work if they feel, whether it's the equipment, whether it's the surroundings, if they feel they are going to be in personal or imminent danger, they have the right to refuse work. And we're going to be going through what that looks like a little later in the presentation today. The understanding, though, is as the employer, whether you're the client or the agency themselves, if there is a refuse to work due to unsafe work, there are very specific procedures or process you need to follow. And again, we will go through it, not in depthly, but we will provide a high level review of what that may look like or what that will need to look like if you do have this sort of issue. We have another multiple choice. What should you do in a site-specific hazard safety assessment at a new customer site? Or what, sorry, when should you? When should you do a site-specific hazard? Should you do it prior to the assignment starting? Should you do it within the first 48 hours of the assignment starting? Prior to the assignment starting, or if new hazards have been introduced to a work site, prior to the assignment starting, repeating when conditions at the work site changes. C, or the answer F, A, C, and D. So please go ahead and record your answer in the meeting chat and we will discuss in a moment. So everyone's answered F. I 100% agree with you. We want to be doing site-specific hazards before it actually becomes a problem. So that includes A, prior to the assignment starting. So if it's a new customer, we want to understand what the work site looks like and ensure that we believe that it's a safe work environment. We want to do it before the assignment starts or if new hazards have been introduced to a work site. So will you be supplying, as well as D, if the work site changes? So are you going to be supplying workers to a new work area? So maybe you were just supplying workers to the front of the factory where they were doing more clerical type work, and now you're going to be supplying forklift drivers. If you haven't seen that specific area of the work site, you want to go take a look at it. Or if there's a new machine, let's say, being put in, or a new line, and you're supplying workers to that work site, and we'll be working at this new line or new machine, you want to be going and taking a look at it, making sure it follows the same safety protocols that you're comfortable with, that you do require in your employment relationship. And one of the easiest ways, one of the easiest ways I've taught this over the years for new people in the staffing world, when they're going to a site inspection, there's a very specific and very easy thing you can do to figure out whether or not it's a safe work environment. And that would be to answer the question is, would you send your husband or wife, your partner, your child, your mother, your father, brother, sister, would you send them to that temporary work assignment? If once you enter the work assignment area and you emphatically say, you know what, I would never send one of my loved ones into this work site, it's too dangerous, you may want to ask some questions about whether you want to have a commercial relationship with that client. It may, that doesn't necessarily mean you don't do it. Maybe you ask for some more information from the client. Maybe you ask for some additional help from other members of your team. But that simple sort of question is, would you send a loved one into that work environment? That can really help you understand whether or not that's a safe work environment and whether it's one you want to be doing commercial business with. So we're going to be changing gears a little bit. We're going to be taking a look at WHMIS. Specifically, it's called WHMIS 2015, the Global Harmonized System. And anyone that's been working within the temporary employment world, especially if we're dealing with any sort of labor environment, probably very accustomed to WHMIS. You're probably doing some sort of training for it, whether it's online or whether it's in-house, inside your office, listening to a video. So essentially, what do you need to know about WHMIS? And we're going to be taking a look at all of these items. We're going to be looking at the history of it, product classification, identification, labeling requirements, safety data sheets, exposure to hazardous materials, provincial and federal regulations, and worker rights. And what this act is it's essentially known as the right to know legislation. And it applies to hazardous products. Several pieces of legislation are cobbled together and they're collectively known as WHMIS, the Workplace Hazardous Materials and Information System. It's a comprehensive plan for providing information on hazardous materials intended for use in workplaces. WHMIS applies in all Canadian workplaces, which are covered by occupational health and safety legislation, and specifically where WHMIS controlled products are used. So if your office does not use, or if the workplace that has no WHMIS controlled products, employees within that environment are not required to perform WHMIS. Generally within our industry, though, we typically cover the education piece of WHMIS. At least from my experience, most companies provide some sort of WHMIS training to the majority of their temporary and contract staff. So one of the things with them is compliance is critical, and therefore knowledge is essential for you, your workers, and your customers. And we'll go through WHMIS a little bit more in depth for some of you that are new to it, as well as maybe answer some questions you've never known about it. I won't go too deep into the history of WHMIS. WHMIS, for all intent and purposes, is a fairly new piece of legislation. In January 1979, the government wanted to take a look at it and decide, they started to see some issues with the number of chemicals being used in the workplace, as well as some of the injuries and problems that they were incurring. And a lot of times what happens is it takes a big incident or a big issue or a big accident, let's say, that really helps kick the can down the road very quickly. And in this case, around the same period of time, November 1979, there was what's called the Mississauga train derailment, which was Mississauga wasn't as big as back then, but it was still a fairly big city within Ontario, within Canada even. And it was a large-scale explosion and ultimately a release of toxic gas that caused the evacuation of 200,000 people. And again, once you have one of those incidents, like anyone that watched the news last night and you saw the bridge in Baltimore where a ship hit in and it fell apart, there's going to be, that's an American example, but anytime one of those incidents happen, it usually causes action. And in this case, where we had this train derailment and 200,000 people were displaced, it really kickstarted this piece of legislation. So a year later, the introduction of the Transportation of Dangerous Goods Act, which designates when you're actually transporting the goods, the substances. And further along in 1980, we had the first tripart, so the government, employers, and labor published WHMIS report of the Project Steering Committee. And in 1988, the execution of WHMIS on a national level, which really implemented this sort of program. 2018 was the culmination, or at least where we are now, completion of the global harmonized system in WHMIS 2015. We'll kind of get into one of those things but the idea is WHMIS, it's not that old, but it is constantly being updated, and it's constantly being updated because we are dealing with new chemicals and new substances, and every week, day, month, there's new things coming into the workplaces that need to be understood, and workers need to be provided the hazards and how to deal with these chemicals on a daily basis. So what is the intent of the global harmonized system? The idea is the GHS will help facilitate trade by eliminating multiple classification systems and enhance protection of human health by using standard and consistent messaging. As of December 1, 2018, all parties must be compliant in Canada with WHMIS 2015. What does this mean? It means before 2015, there was a mishmash of legislation regarding hazardous substances. And this example on the right is one such example of a chemical or substance that was used across the world, and the effects of how this having not a harmonized system in place. So this substance in Canada, US, Japan, and Korea was listed as toxic. In the EU, Australia, Malaysia, and Thailand was listed as harmful, moderately toxic in China, hazardous in New Zealand, and in India, it was listed as non-toxic. Same substance, same chemical, exactly the same. Every country had a different classification for the same chemical. What we are experiencing is a world where we have a global harmonized system. Products are moving back and forth between countries, and so the governments within all these countries took a look at it and said, okay, we can't have this. The same substance in India that's non-toxic is deemed toxic in Canada, US, Japan, and Korea. Substance the same. What's the issue? And the issue was the clarification or the designation of these substances. So we want to make sure that if you buy a substance in India or you buy it in Canada, you know exactly the toxic effects that that chemical or substance may have. It helps to equal the playing field, and it helps to make sure that employee safety is maintained on a worldwide basis. There are 5 areas for changes, and this is talking about the changes from the old WHMIS to the new WHMIS. We won't really get it. We've been dealing with the new WHMIS 2018 for 6 years now, so we won't get too deep into this. But what it did do is establish new classification of hazardous products, new classification of physical products in some instances, classification of health products, hazard communication of other products, especially around labeling, and any exemptions or future state of knowledge. So again, I'm not going to get into the differences. We've been living in this world now for a long time, so it's not so important to understand the differences, but we will go through what those differences actually mean on a day-to-day basis. Now, one of the key components of WHMIS is the usage of what are called pictograms. And this is an example. These are the Canadian example. There may be some different examples in other countries, but these are the ones that Canada has adopted. And the pictograms are graphic images that immediately show the user a hazardous product, what type of hazard is present. With a quick glance, you can see, for example, that the product is flammable or it might be a health hazard. And the great thing about the pictograms is they're fairly intuitive. So the gas cylinder, it looks like a gas cylinder, easily recognized, even if you don't have, if English is your first, or not your first language, let's say. By usage of the pictograms, by usage of essentially very intuitive sort of icons or graphics, you can understand what the hazard may be. Like corrosion looks like corrosion, flame looks like flame. Skull and crossbones, very few people would misidentify that as not being hazardous. And then most of the pictograms have what's called a distinctive red square set on its points border. Inside the border is a symbol that represents a potential hazard, fire, health, corrosive. And the symbol in the border referred to as a pictogram. And pictograms are assigned to specific hazard classes or categories. Substance could have one pictogram, it could have multiple pictograms, depending on its actual inertness or what it actually does. And within this area, there's 2 essential groups, what we call major groups of hazards. We have a physical and a health hazard. And each hazard group includes classes that have specific hazardous properties. So the physical hazards group is based on the physical or chemical properties of the product, such as flammability, reactivity, or corrosivity to metals. And then the health hazard group is based on the ability of the product to cause a health effect, such as an eye irritation, respiratory issue, allergy, asthma, breathing difficulties, or if it may cause cancer. Within the health classes, we see some examples. So the physical hazards would be flammable gases or flammable liquids or oxidizing liquids, corrosive to metals. Those are things that are actually occurring with the chemical itself. And then what we have are the health hazards. What effect does it have on the human body? Acute toxicity, skin corrosion, respiratory skin sensitization, reproductive toxicity, aspiration hazard. And what that means is how it affects the actual human on a personal level. And the hazard classes are grouping together products that have similar properties. Most of the hazard classes are common to GHS and will be used worldwide by all countries that have adopted GHS. Some of the hazard classes are more specific to Canada, to WHMIS 2015, but overall, a much more harmonized sort of system when we're looking at it. We have another question here. Labeling, true or false? Labeling materials is a way health hazard information is made available to users, and although it's not required by law, it is recommended that all hazard materials be labeled. So it's true or false. So please go ahead and take a minute and answer in the chat section, if labeling materials is not required by law, it is recommended that all hazard materials be labeled. True or false, please? Okay, so we have some great answers. Everyone has, at least everyone that has recorded it, has said false. Bit of a tricky question because, you know, it says is not required by law. Labeling is required by law. I'm going to go through what that means in a little bit, but the answer is false. Labels are required by WHMIS law. In Canada, WHMIS is one of the ways health hazard information is made available to anyone using the material. Labels are important because they are the first alert that hazards associated with using the product and therefore covered by WHMIS legislation. Labels also tell us what precautions to take when using the product and inform the person that there is an SCA sheet available which contains more detailed information on the product. So just a question popped up from Whitney, sorry. Should we be using WHMIS 2023 now? No, it's labeled 2018. That's when it was required by essentially everyone. The old one was labeled as 2008, so WHMIS, or 1998 rather, 88 rather. So it would really, the year designation doesn't matter. It's just called WHMIS now. So no, there's no need to update it. If you're looking through any sort of legislation or book, it's going to be labeled as 2018, and that's just when it was required by law to be implemented by everyone. So hopefully that answers your question. Another multiple choice. What is the purpose of labeling? So labels tell us what precautions to take when using. Labels are required under government regulations. You can relabel at any time when there's a change in substance. It tells you that there's additional information on the SDS, all of the above, or answer F, A, B, and D only. Please take a moment to record your answer and we'll discuss in a moment. So overwhelmingly, I think the answer E and F were presented. The best answer in this case is F. And the reason I say that is because number C isn't correct. Can't relabel anytime there's a change in substance. And we'll get into exactly what that means, but again, a little bit of a trick question. This isn't my favorite question on the course, but it is something that, in this case, the best answer is A, B, and D. And one of the reasons labels are important is because, again, they are the first alert that there may be hazards associated with using the product and therefore covered by WHMIS legislation. So it's really something that tells us, you know what, it's not just a water bottle. This is something that could harm me potentially or will require certain precautions be taken when I'm actually using this. We're going to be taking a look at the labels themselves now, and I'll give you some examples, and we'll kind of go through what the rationale are behind these things. And there are two different types of labels. There's a supplier label and a workplace label. We're going to start with the supplier label, and I'll show you an example on the next slide what that looks like. So a supplier label, it must be here in Canada, it must be in one of our two official languages, so either English or French. Or English and French rather. Product identifier, which means the brand name, the chemical name, the common name, generic name, or trade name of their hazardous product. We need to know what that product is. So we need to be able to identify what the product is versus what something else. The initial supplier identifier. So the name, address, telephone number of either the manufacturer, the Canadian manufacturer, or the Canadian importer. So we need to know if something disastrous happens and we need more information, who do we contact about that specific product? So we need to take a look at the people who created it in Canada, manufactured it, or the people who brought it in from another country. So they are the Canadian importer of it. They are required by law to have the most current up-to-date information on that substance and how to handle that substance. The label must have a pictogram, which we just discussed a couple slides ago. Must have the signal words, danger, warning. Danger is used for high-risk hazards, while warning is used for less severe hazards, obviously. Must have the hazard statement, which are the standardized phrases which describe the nature of the hazard. Precautionary statement, which describes the measures to be taken to minimize or prevent adverse effects resulting from exposure to a hazardous product or resulting from improper handling or storage of a hazardous product, as well as supplemental label information. That could be precautionary actions, hazards not yet included, the GHS, physical state, or route of exposure. So again, we need to make sure that the labels are provided in both official languages, English and French. This is an example of what a supplier label could look like. There's no requirements regarding the aesthetic of the label itself, other than it has to have these items on it. So it could look slightly different. It could, the actual font could be different, or the color of it. It has to have these items. So you have to have the identifier. So in this case, it's product K1. You have to have your pictogram. You have to have your signal words. So in this case, it's danger. Your hazard statement of what may happen, precautionary statements, and lastly, in this example, we have the supplier or the distributor of the product. So we know exactly where to go to if we need more information. In this case, suppliers are responsible for labeling the women's control products that they provide to customers. So when you're buying it, the manufacturer of it or the importer has to have it on the product themselves. The customers, sometimes the workers, are responsible for labeling or relabeling products in the workplace, which we'll get into on the next slide for workplace labels. But as it comes into your facility, if you're purchasing it, and as a temporary employment agency, you want to make sure your client has a WMIS program in place, because again, safety as well as it is required under the legislation for this. The next example is what a workplace label is, and there is no requirement for how a workplace label should look. The workplace label has these 3 requirements, though. It could have more information, but these are the 3 minimum baseline information that it must have. Must have the product name, which matches the SDS product name. So it has to be what the official name of it is, or whatever is on the SDS sheets. Has to have safe handling precautions. It may include pictograms, but it may include other supplier label information. In this case, we have some PPE required and some proper procedures on safely handling it. And then lastly, it needs to have a reference to the SDS if available. So a safety data sheet is available. The difference between a workplace label and a supplier label is a workplace label is required when a hazardous product is produced at the workplace and used in the workplace. So if, let's say, you're mixing 2 chemicals together, it's not necessarily has the SDS, but you're creating something. Hazardous product is decanted, so it's transferred or poured into another container. So if you're taking it from a big 50-gallon drum and putting it into a more manageable, a sprayer, let's say, you have to apply a label on it. Or if a supplier label becomes lost or illegible. So if you can no longer read it, or if it's fallen off the actual vessel that you're using to use the product, you have to provide a workplace label. There's 2 situations where a workplace label is not required, and that's when it is poured into a container and it's going to be used immediately or under the control of the person who decanted it. So those 2 examples. If I am pouring it from, let's say, the vessel where it came in, the 50-gallon drum, and I'm going to be using the entirety of the contents, so a little cup of the material, I'm using it all at once. I'm the only person. It's going to be used immediately. Or if I'm the only person that's going to be using it, so under the control of the person who decanted it. So if I'm the only person who's going to be using it for the entirety of the shift, and it will be done by the end of my shift, we don't have to provide a workplace label. Is that a good reason? No, you probably still want to know exactly what that material is, and applying a label is probably a best practice. But those 2 situations does mean that you don't require a workplace label. So what is a hazard statement? So every hazard class category has a hazard statement, which we took a look at. They're brief, standardized sentences tell you more about the exact hazard of the product. They're generally short, but they describe the most significant hazards of the product. So a couple examples. Extremely flammable gas. Contains gas under pressure, may explode if heated. Fatal if inhaled. Causes eye irritation or may cause cancer. So these examples are very succinct. They're very, they're not overly verbose. They're quickly identified and quickly, consumed as you read them. Each hazard class and category has an assigned hazard statement, brief, standardized sentences that tell you more about the exact hazard of the product. They should be short, but they need to describe the most significant hazards of the product. They also need to help describe the degree of the hazard. For example, may cause cancer is more hazardous than suspected of causing cancer. So they do have to be descriptive to what may actually occur by utilization of that product. We have another multiple choice. What does SDS stand for under WHMIS? Safety data sheets, safety directive sheets, safety decree sheets, safely dictate sheets. We have some quick draws on the call today. Answer A is overwhelmingly provided. Yes, safety data sheets. What does safety data sheet stand for? It's a document that contains information on potential hazards, health, fire reactivity, environmental, and how to work safely with the chemical product. Again, going back to a previous slide, it's important to note that SDS sheets are prepared by the supplier or the manufacturer of the material. They are much more in depth. They're much bigger than the labels are. They, could be 8, could be 10 pages of information. But it delves into more finite bits of information on the product and safely using it and what to do if you're exposed to it. What to do if accidents occur. So SDS sheets are an essential starting point for the development of a complete health and safety program. I draw your attention to that because you want to make sure that any sort of client that you're working with that is required for WHMIS purpose is or does have a WHMIS program in place, including SDS sheets, including labeling, including training. All those things are required under legislation. You want to make sure, again, that you have coordinated with your client who's doing what training. Very important. What's a WHMIS worker education program? Education programs, we're kind of going through most of it today. What do they have to include? They have to include information on labels, SDF sheets, hazard information, procedures, uses, handling, storage, disposal, presence of hazardous materials, and emergency procedures. So the law requires that employers educate a worker exposed or likely to be exposed to a controlled product. An exposed worker is any worker who stores, handles, uses, or disposes of a controlled product, or who supervises another worker performing these activities. It is the responsibility of the employer to understand who those people are going to be and to ensure that they are trained appropriately based on the legislation. One of the questions I get asked a lot is, after a worker has completed the education program, is any follow-up required? Yes, the employer on record is expected to try and ensure that the worker has understood the training materials. So generally that is some sort of test, you want some sort of written test, and is able to put into practice what he or she has learned. Again, a test after the education program is generally the best practice for that. And you want to make sure that this is done yearly in the case of WHMIS. So retraining, it's a little more daunting when you have our type of work environment where you have workers coming and going a lot, but it is still a requirement under WHMIS. Best practice, make sure it's done every year for your staff, for your full-time staff, temporary staff, etc. What are the employee responsibilities? Workers must participate in the education and training sessions and follow safe work procedures established by the employer as well as the customer site. Workers, they have to work in compliance with the Act. So once they do receive training, they have to actually follow the Act and follow the information and training they've completed. If they do not, that would be a safety infraction and they should be written up or disciplined accordingly. they are required to wear the prescribed PPEs, equipment, and clothing. They can't just say they don't want to wear the safety glasses. If the workplace has designated that safety glasses are required based on the hazard assessment, based on the SDS sheets, based on the chemicals used in that workplace, then the worker is required to wear the prescribed PPE. Workers also have a responsibility to report any hazards, machine defects, and any contraventions of the act to a supervisor. So the important thing to note is, a lot of time legislation and requirements and government sort of regulations are typically fall upon the employer, or at least as the agency, where they fall upon us. It's important to note that the employees themselves do have the responsibilities, and that allows you to, if there are infractions, again, you can discipline them, you can coach them. The idea is to make sure that they are operating safely and that they're able to go home every day in a safe manner, the same way that they arrived at work that day. So we're going to be switching gears to unsuspecting hazards. I have 2:05 on my clock right now. Let's say 2:06. We're going to come back at 2:11. So 5 minutes right from now. I'm going to pause the example, and 2:11, please come back. Take a break, get up and stretch, go to the washroom, check your email, do whatever you want to do. 2:11, we're back. Okay, that's 5 minutes. Hopefully everyone's well rested, stood up, stood away from the desk for a moment. We're going to be switching gears a little bit. We're done the WMIS aspect of the training today. We're going to start looking at hazards. Hazards are something that can be found in every workplace. They come from a wide range of sources. And this section is going to be looking at some of the more common workplace hazards and how to eliminate or control them, or at least, if not, identify the hazards as they may be in the workplace. We'll be taking a look at a case study. And this one is from Ontario in 2015. And in this particular case, there were 3 workers that were working on an asbestos abatement project at a single family home. The abatement area was enclosed. In the area, certain asbestos containing materials had been removed and there was asbestos dust hazard present. An MOL inspector attended and conducted an inspection. The inspector found one of the workers exiting the enclosed area wearing street clothing. 2 other workers were found inside the enclosed area not wearing PPE, not wearing protective clothing. One was performing cleanup and the other was securing bags filled with asbestos containing material. Essentially, this company was charged. The company themselves pleaded guilty to failing to ensure that only persons wearing protective clothing and equipment enter a work area where there is asbestos dust hazard. Company was fined $25,000, and ultimately, the supervisor was fined $4,000 after pleading guilty to failing to ensure workers use protective clothing and equipment. So, taking a look at this as a case study, if we were the temporary employment agency supplying workers to this customer, what would we have done differently? What would you have done in advance of this order to ensure that your company wasn't subjected to these sort of things? Let's take 1 minute and record your answers in the chat function, and then we will discuss those answers going forward. So what sort of things were present that we would have done, because we are all ACSESS members and astute health and safety experts? What would we have done to ensure that this didn't happen to our company? Okay, I'm not seeing too many answers in the chat function. Oh, we have one here. Have the customer provide in writing the equipment being used, the job roles, and what is required for PB? Is there training and conduct a site visit? Yeah, excellent answer to this. That basically touches on most of the points. Again, we have responsibilities as employment agencies. We're sending employees out to work at different client work sites that we're not specifically in care and control of. We need to ensure a couple more answers. All potential hazards, train employees, absolutely. Training on hazards is required. Train on PPE. Verify that the PPE is used. Great example, Leanne. Employees are not allowed to enter the enclosed area as long as they're not wearing proper equipment, correct PPE. Yeah, absolutely. Everyone's nailing it on the head now that we got it. PPE in this case is required. Asbestos is one of those substances where it was actually pretty much used in everything. It was a wonder material. It didn't burn. Essentially, you could put a torch right to it, it wouldn't burn. And essentially what we did in the pre-70s, so 50s, 60s, maybe even the 40s, we used it in everything. We used it in shingles, we used it paint, we used it, pipe wrapping. Any sort of old building. If you're buying an old house and it was built in the 60s, more than likely you have asbestos in your house. It was the wonder sort of item used. The thing about asbestos is if it's inert, if it's in place, it's generally safe. Once you actually start, it's called friable, but once you cut it or displace it and it becomes airborne, it can then be ingested or inhaled rather into the lungs of the person. And there's no safe limit of inhaling asbestos. We don't know whether it's 1 gram or 1,000 grams of it, or the government has just said, look, any little bit of asbestos is completely unsafe, and we have very specific rules and requirements for dealing with asbestos. So everyone's examples: PPE, training, know the hazards, make sure that the PPE is worn, site inspections, all of those would have prevented this sort of case. We would have known, our employees are working with asbestos. They have to have the proper training, PPE, all those things. And more than likely, we wouldn't have supplied labor to that, or we would have ensured that there was a solid understanding with the client about how all those things were being handled. So, great example, everyone, of what we should have been doing in this case. What are some hidden dangers? What are designated substances? Designated substances, and we'll get into them exactly, but they are biological agents. They could be chemical agents, physical agents, or any sort of combination of the above. A designated substances is an Ontario reference. Other provinces do have it, but what we're going to be discussing very specifically is in Ontario legislation. It is, again, check if you're in a different province in Ontario, definitely check if you have a similar sort of regulation in your province. But essentially, hazards and substances, as I was just discussing with asbestos, they could be anywhere, and likely they are everywhere. So something like asbestos, if you're, a big case that happens with some of these older, like elementary schools and high schools, they're starting to renovate them now, and they're experiencing real issues because a lot of the building materials used previously in the schools and any of the old workplaces or buildings had asbestos in it. So now we're actually dealing with it. Thankfully, we understand the hazards associated with asbestos, but there are a lot of other chemicals that have very similar sort of hazard issues and complications with human health that are being reviewed at this point. So designated substances, we're going to go through what the list of 11 of them are. I can never say the first one, acrylonitrile. Arsenic, asbestos. We're going to go through what these are. And so within Ontario, we have what's called Regulation 490. It's been updated recently, but it takes a look at what very specific designated substances are. And when they are present in the workplace, and again, important as temporary employment agency companies, we need to know if they are present in our client work sites. And conversely, we need to ensure that if they are present in the work site, that the client has the specific requirements under Regulation 490 to deal with those substances. What that means is the supervisor must conduct an assessment of the use of the designated substance, have to determine if a health hazard exists for workers and whether or not a control program is required. And the supervisor assessment itself has to take a look at the information on use, handling, storage, and disposal of that substance, actual and potential exposure of workers to the substance. So just because it is present doesn't necessarily mean people are being exposed to it. It might be in an off-site area. And lastly, the methods and procedures required to control the substance. So how do we work with that substance if it is present? So designated substance, I'll go through like what examples of this generally are. Arsenic, strong poison, it's used in wood preservatives, insecticides, herbicides. Could be used in alloys of copper and lead. Asbestos, we discussed, it's in basically anything before the mid 70s, I think it was 78. They said you can't use it anymore. And they gave about 8 years to get rid of old material. So basically anything under 86 shouldn't be seeing asbestos in most things if it's within Canada. Benzene, generally made to use other chemicals, which are then used to make plastic, resin, nylon, rubber, lubricants, detergents, drugs, pesticides. It's a natural component of crude oil and gasoline. Ethylene oxide is from ethylene glycol, surfactants, fumigants, fungicides, and petroleum emulsifiers. Coke oven emissions are the airborne constituents of the byproduct created by the destructive distillation of coal, so basically burning coal, and petroleum. The emissions can occur from the production of steel, from petroleum products, and from the lining of high temperature furnaces. Isocyanates could be from spray foam insulation, sealants, finishes, paint, and auto body materials. Lead, a lot of old paint contain lead, old mortar, old water pipes, especially if it's an older building, in the early 1900s, good chance there's lead in the pipes if it hasn't been updated. Lead sheeting, contaminated soil. Mercury is in older fluorescent lights, could be in some switches and pressure gauges, electrodes, and contaminated soil. Silica is a big one, and it's because we're really understanding the destructive nature of silica. Silica is in bricks and blocks, granite, abrasives, concrete, sandstone, cement, and mortar. And it's typically used when people are sanding and grinding. Again, it comes up in the air, and then you're actually ingesting silica. It's getting into the lungs, and we're noticing some far-reaching health effects from long-standing use or misuse, rather, of PPE and people actually working with these type of materials. And lastly, vinyl chloride used to manufacture PVC, which is used in furniture. It's used in basically anything. So any sort of plastic products, pipes, wires, cable coating, all those things could have vinyl chloride. The important thing is when you're doing your site inspections, you may want to ask your client, do you have any designated substances on site? Are my employees going to be exposed to it? Hopefully your client should have an understanding of what their obligations are under the Occupational Health and Safety Act, and they will identify, yes, we do have designated substances, or no, we do not. If they do have it, doesn't necessarily mean you don't do business with them. It just means you need to dig further into it and find out if that's a safe work environment. Have they done the assessment? Do they have controls in place for dealing with it? And is it controlled on who's going to be exposed to utilizing those substances? Very important questions you want to ask, especially within our world. We're going to be taking a look at some other hazards, and these are more universal in workplaces. They're more, the designated substances, those are generally for manufacture or construction. You're going to be exposed to those things more likely or not. These sort of hazards are more universal to the workplace themselves. And the first one, confined spaces. Confined spaces includes items like silos or vats, could be tankers, could be sewers, pipes, rail cars, aircraft wings, boilers, manholes, pits and storage bins. Ditches and trenches may also be confined space, or access or egress is limited. What does that mean? A confined space is generally any area where humans aren't meant to be for any length of time. They generally include limited means of getting in and getting out, limited air supply, very specific regulations in dealing with confined spaces, because the hazard is very real. A lot of times what you find with confined spaces is if someone is in, let's say, a tanker car, and they're cleaning it out and they pass out. They pass out because there's some sort of gas in place and there's no sort of program in place for confined space. A lot of times what happens is someone goes in to rescue them and they also pass out. So now instead of having one person who is debilitated, you have two people. And you still have a work area where there is, it's causing them to pass out. Confined spaces is absolutely something you want to find out if your client is doing. If they are, again, every jurisdiction in Canada has very specific protocols associated with confined space. You want to make sure you understand them, at least if your client is doing it, that they are operating within, proper procedures. Indoor air quality, very poignant. As we're hopefully moving out of COVID, air quality was something that was on the forefront of all our minds, especially if anyone that was still working, if you went to a hospital or dentist or any sort of medical. Air quality was very important because we had an issue where if something was in the air, it was infecting other people. So what does indoor air quality include? heating and ventilation systems, are the big thing. Is air being exchanged between the environment outside and inside? Is it moving, or is it stale and stagnant? Contamination by construction materials. Again, so if you are putting things up in the air and the air isn't moving in or out of the work environment, you do have a buildup of potential buildup of harmful sort of items. Indoor air quality problems arise when, some of the following causes. If you have, bad temperature, humidity, mold, lighting is bad, excessive noise, dust, mold, fungi, bacteria, gases, vapors, odors. All those things make indoor air quality unsustainable and unmanageable for humans to operate in. And it is something that is, we're getting much more information on. We do understand how important air quality is, especially as we just come out of COVID. That was one of the main sort of risk factors for that was poor indoor air quality. Third thing we have is lasers. Laser beams, just not used in manufacturing. If you're working in any sort of environment, lasers are being used more and more. The hazards, they include eye and skin burns due to laser beam shining on a person's body. Non-beam hazards include the fumes emitted when materials are burned by the lasers. So laser plumes, if they're doing surgical procedures, if they're doing cosmetic sort of procedures. Scents and temperatures, that is something that is increasingly on people's radars. So anyone that has seen, walked into a business and has said we're a scent-free environment, a lot of times it's because someone has a very adverse reaction to specific scents or perfumes or that sort of thing. And the idea is we're trying to manage the safety of our employees. Generally the scents, they deal with the smells or odors from cosmetics a lot of times, or air fresheners and cleaners. And some of the problems include adverse health effects, such as headaches, dizziness, nausea. Temperature is another one, a hazard. And temperature is the number one complaint in offices. It's either too hot or too cold. No one's quite happy with the temperature in the office. That's a little different than actual hazard, though. That's generally more of a comfort thing. I'm too hot or I'm a bit too cold. Temperature becomes much more of a problem, and health and safety regulations view this as a problem because there's no high limit temperature. So they don't say like after 25 degrees Celsius, you have to do certain things. They do generally have requirements for low temperature. So the idea of hyperthermia and frostbite being very real issues when people are being exposed to cold environments. So if they're like an example, like a forklift driver, if they're working in a food area where they're coming in and out of freezers, spending a long time in freezers, they could have very real effects. That doesn't mean the high temperature isn't an issue. It just means generally within legislation, you have to be concerned about low temperatures. High temperatures have their own problems, though. You have issues like heat stroke and associated ailments like that. So if it's too hot, you do want to ensure there's breaks, there's access to water, access to shade, that sort of thing. Ventilation kind of coincides with indoor air quality. I liken them the same. It's the actual mechanical system in the building that brings in fresh outdoor air and removes contaminated indoor air. It works to reduce airborne issues by removing fumes, dust, vapors in order to provide a healthy and safe working environment. We have weather. So weather could be items like lightning, driving tips in poor weather. Obviously, if your worker is exposed to outdoor work, it is much more of an issue than sort of indoor work regarding weather. But it's absolutely, you do want to have some programs in place, or at least ensure your customers have programs in place when there is inclement weather, or very inclement weather rather. Working alone, I skipped over violence. We're going to delve into violence in the next couple slides. So I'm skipping over violence for now, but last one, working alone. While not always a hazard, working alone, it does have the potential for issues. and it's generally when other circumstances are present. So if a situation is in high or low risk, it's going to depend on a number of factors, including location, the type of work, whether they're interacting with the public, if there's consequences of an emergency accident, a lot of times if they're dealing with money, and a wide variety of circumstances make it important to assess each situation individually. Working alone, the classic example I always give with working alone is gas station attendants. So a lot of them, in previous years, a decade or so ago, they're having real issues. And the issues wasn't so much that they were working alone. The fact was they were working alone in an environment where there was money involved, people were dealing with the public. There's high value items that they were responsible for, including the cash and some of the items behind the counter were high value. And what they were experiencing are, as an industry, they identified, working alone in those environments, and they started doing certain things to increase worker safety. It could be bars on the windows, it could be changing closing times, it could be bringing on a secondary employee during nighttime work, let's say. But working alone is something that is a major hazard. Some of the provinces across Ontario have specific working alone requirements or legislation. And if you're operating in other than Ontario, you do want to check to see if the working alone legislation applies to you. But generally in Ontario, every reasonable precaution item would cover the working alone. So we don't have specific legislation about working alone, but our general legislation covers the safety aspect of working alone. Next couple slides, we're going to be looking at harassment and violence in the workplace. A big topic, and we're not going to delve too deep into it, but we will give you a very good primer on these requirements. In Ontario, and I would say the vast majority of provinces now have some sort of violence and harassment legislation in place. They're all very similar. Some of the very specifics of them may be different, but they're very similar across the board, and for good reason. I mean, it's as we get into it, I'll explain further. Workplace harassment, and these definitions are from Ontario, from the Ontario Occupational Health and Safety Act. It's engaging in a course of vexatious comment or conduct against a worker in a workplace that is known or ought reasonably be known to be unwelcome, or workplace sexual harassment. And workplace harassment can involve unwelcome words or actions that are known or should be known to be offensive, embarrassing, humiliating, or demeaning to a worker, a group of workers, or a group of people in a workplace. It can include behavior that intimidates, isolates, or even discriminates against a targeted individual. It could include items like making jokes, innuendos that demean, ridicule, intimidate, or offend. It could be displaying or circulating offensive picture or materials in print or electronic form. It could include bullying. It could include repeated offensive or intimidating phone calls or emails, or workplace sexual harassment. And harassment is something that, we don't look at it the same way. If you ever watch a movie from the 50s, the workplaces that they depict are, they're abhorrent when you look at them today. We've grown as a society. We understand that harassment and violence in the workplace is not acceptable. You don't go to work to be harassed or be subject to violence and harassment or harassment. And that sort of progression of society, to my eyes, very welcome. What we need to be doing is looking at these items and not immediately dismissing them. We have to take a look at if harassment is in the workplace, if you're being harassed, you will have to, depending on your province, there are certain precautions that you need to take, including an investigation. One of the questions that gets misinterpreted, especially by employees, is what is workplace harassment versus what isn't workplace harassment. And what isn't workplace harassment is a reasonable action taken by an employer or supervisor relating to the management and direction of workers on the workplace. So that means giving employees coaching or defining the metrics that they need to adhere to or how to do their job. Reasonable management actions would be part of the manager's or supervisor's normal work function and could include changes in work assignment, scheduling, job assessment, evaluation, workplace inspections, implementation of health and safety measures, and disciplinary action. What that means is when a supervisor is doing their job and supervising an employee and telling them, you know what, you have to do your job, that's not harassment. That is the supervisor doing the requirements of their position to ensure that the company is operating safely and getting the work output from the employee that is required. However, if these actions are not exercised reasonably and fairly, they may constitute workplace harassment. For example, if a worker is not scheduled for a shift solely based on his or her sexual orientation, there should likely be workplace harassment. The difference there is the power dynamics, where then the supervisor isn't actually performing their job, they're using other means to get what they want, I guess, in this case. Workplace sexual harassment, defined a little bit differently, but within the same realm, within the same sort of context. It's engaging in the course of vexatious comment or conduct against a worker in a workplace because of sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, or gender expression, where the course of a comment or conduct is known or ought reasonably to be known to be unwelcome, or making a sexual solicitation or advance where the person making the advance is in a position to confer, grant, or deny benefit or advancement to the worker, and the person knows or ought reasonably knows what a solicitation or advance is unwelcome. What does this mean pragmatically? It means workplace sexual harassment can involve unwelcome words, unwelcome actions associated with sex, sexual orientation, gender, that are known or should be known to be offensive, embarrassing, humiliating, or demeaning to a worker or group of workers in a workplace. It could also include behavior that intimidates or isolates individuals. Workplace sexual harassment can include items like asking questions, talking or writing about sexual activities, rough or vulgar humor or language related to sexuality, sexual orientation, or gender, displaying or circulating pornography, sexual images, or offensive sexual jokes in print or electronic form, leering or inappropriate staring, invading personal space, unnecessary physical contact, including inappropriate touching, demanding hugs, dates, or sexual favors, demanding making gender-related comments about someone's physical characteristics, mannerisms, or conformity, sex-type roles, verbally abusing, threatening, or taunting someone based on gender or sexual orientation, or threatening to penalize or otherwise punish a worker if they refuse a sexual advance. The important thing to understand is workplace sexual harassment. It doesn't matter intent. It matters how the person is receiving it. So you could tell a joke to 10 people and 9 people could find it funny. If one person finds it offensive based on one of these sort of items that I've included, that could be deemed workplace sexual harassment. It doesn't matter that you didn't mean it. It doesn't mean you're just joking. It doesn't matter that, most of the people found it funny. In the context of occupational health and safety law now, that would be or could be very likely deemed to be workplace sexual harassment if you told that sort of offensive joke. And employers are increasingly, A, because of legislation and requirement, but B, we understand that that does not create a good work environment. And that sort of stuff, it doesn't need to be in a work environment. Keep it at home. You're not responsible. The employer is not responsible for your actions at home in general. Does not have a place in the workplace though. Lastly, when conduct or behavior includes inappropriate sexual touching, anything of that nature, this could also constitute a criminal offense. And one of the things I caution you against, if it does breach that area, that would be outside of the employer sort of purview, and you want to be getting, especially if it's reaching sexual assault sort of status, you want to be consulting. The police should be notified in those cases, especially if you're investigating this. If it gets to that point, that's generally outside of what the employer would want to or should deal with, because it is outside of the that sort of legislation and is more in the criminal code. Workplace violence. It means the exercise of physical force by a person against a worker in a workplace that causes or could cause physical injury to the worker. It's an attempt to exercise physical force against a worker in the workplace that could cause physical injury. Or lastly, it could be a statement or behavior. So it doesn't actually have to be physical. That it's reasonable for a worker to interpret it as a threat to exercise physical force against the worker in a workplace that could cause physical injury to the workplace. These, again, it's not just the physical act. It's not just, punching another worker, or pushing another worker, or throwing a hammer at another worker. The idea is statements that, I'm going to beat you up in the parking lot after work. That's workplace violence. And in most cases, you want to be examining that and taking a look at it and treating it as a real complaint. Especially in the case where a threat turns into an actual action. If you were seen as the employer as knowing that that threat occurred and the physical action occurred after, you as the employer would be held more culpable in that case. So what is some of the workplace violence? What could it mean? I kind of touched on some of them, but it could be verbally threatening to attack a worker. It could be leaving threatening notes or sending threatening emails to a workplace, shaking a fist in a worker's face, wielding some sort of weapon at work, hitting or trying to hit a worker, throwing an object at a worker, sexual violence against a worker, kicking an object at the worker where they're standing, or trying to run down a worker using a vehicle or equipment such as forklift. Again, workplace violence is a little better understood than harassment for most people, because we look at it as more of a physical, but we do need to understand in the workplace and in the context of legislation for health and safety, violence by way of threats, by way of verbal behaviors can be deemed to be workplace violence, and you do want to understand the difference between them. Okay. Moving on, we're taking a look at hazardous sound levels. Hazardous sound levels are one of the things that as we enter, or as we have older workers in the workplace who have been working for their whole life, we're starting to see people having more hearing issues, and we're starting to understand them a little bit better. And unfortunately, we do have workers that were working in the 70s and the 80s where we didn't have the same sort of regulations that we have now. We're starting to see a lot more hearing induced issues. And we've implemented hazardous sound levels for a long time now, because we did understand, okay, we took a look at it and people were experiencing hearing loss at young ages. So we implemented some very specific things. OELs, which are the occupational exposure limits, is a noise are typically given as the maximum duration of exposure permitted for various noise levels. They're often displayed in exposure duration tables and depend on two key factors. Criterion, which is the steady noise level permitted for a full 8-hour work shift. So that would be the background noise. So the overall noise of the workplace. It wouldn't include, someone dropping a hammer. It would be the machine hum or the talking or all the machines put together, and how you're exposed to them for the full 8-hour work shift. And we use 8-hour work shift as the definition for this. And then you have what's called the exchange rate, the amount by which the permitted sound level may increase if the exposure time is halved. So that would be along the lines of if you were only exposed to a bit louder of a noise for a short period of time, you're not being exposed for the full 8 hours, so you're not going to have the same sort of hazard issue. Each jurisdiction will have specific limits set out. But in general, what I'm going to discuss right now are the Ontario limits. So the OEL in Ontario is the max criterion level is 85 decibels for an 8-hour shift. 15 minutes is allowable if it goes up to 105. So what that means is I can be exposed, or a worker can be exposed in the workplace to 105 decibels for a maximum of 15 minutes. There are various limits, and the protection is based on the exposure. Again, it's something where you do have to be cognizant of as we're supplying workers. And it could be, when you're taking a look at how to help this, I said earlier that the maximum criterion level is 85. So if the workplace is, let's say, 87 decibels, and it's that loud for the entire shift, you're over what is allowed. And so what we do is we generally implement PPE. In this case, like the picture, we have the earmuffs that will bring down that level. Different earmuffs have different levels that they'll bring it down. It could be 8 dB, it could be 5 dB. And for every workplace, you need to understand what is required. Generally, for our purposes, if the client is in a work area where it's very loud, you do want to know if PPE is required, if they know what the levels are. And a lot of the bigger players are going to have some sort of hearing protection system in place. In our case, we want to know, okay, who's supplying the PPE? Is it the client? Do we have to supply it? Is it the employee? You want to make sure, first off, that the employee is wearing the proper PPE so they're not being exposed to levels where they could injure themselves. Switching gears a little bit too, first aid requirements. First aid requirements are a little bit different. In most cases, they're within the provincial compensation acts of the provinces themselves. There is some movement, so this information will likely change. It is changing now. There's some work to align all the provinces a little bit better, so all the first aid requirements are the same. Because right now it's a complete mishmash. So every province has different first aid requirements in terms of like a first aid kit, different inventory requirements in Ontario versus Quebec versus New Brunswick versus Alberta. It's kind of a mess actually, and hopefully within the next few years we'll have that amended. But for now, every province has their own very specific first aid requirements. Every province does have first aid requirements, like people have to be trained on it. But in general, the particulars of it are different in each province. What I'm going through today is Ontario. What the requirements are is employers, customers, so forth, workplaces themselves have to have first aid equipment and services, has to be inspected quarterly. First aid stations have to be easily accessible, and they have to actually be near the worker who's trained in it. It doesn't make any sense if the first aid kit is, a kilometer away from where they are. That makes no sense. They have to have a notice displaying the first aid poster, first aid certificates, first aid qualified trained workers on duty, and the kit inspection card. And there has to be detailed records of all incidents and first aid treatment given. Here in Ontario, we have what's called Regulation 1101 under the Workplace Safety Insurance Act, which defines the first aid requirements. Training is required. Again, I do caution you, this is Ontario only, so if you're in a different province, but this is Ontario. The definition is standard first aid is required for workplaces with 6 or more workers on any shift. First aid stations are under the care of the worker with a valid first aid certificate at all times, and first aid should be able to reach an injured worker or ill worker within a 2-minute walk. That generally means you may need a number of first aid people, especially if you have a very large work area or you have workers that are spread out. The best practice is within a 2-minute walk period. CPR is now a mandatory module as part of the first aid training program. OSA and critical injury. A critical injury is defined as an injury that is serious in nature and does the following: place your life in jeopardy, produces unconsciousness, or results in substantial loss of blood, involves the fracture of a leg or arm but not a finger or toe, involves the amputation of a leg, arm, hand, or foot, but not a finger or toe, consists of burns to a major part of the body, causes the loss of sight and an eye. When a critical injury occurs, the employer must notify the Ministry of Labor. They must do it immediately by telephone, and they must contact a member of the Joint Health and Safety Committee. Together, they must conduct a thorough investigation. Section 51 of OSA requires that all critical injuries be investigated, and a written report must be prepared and forwarded to the Ministry of Labor within 48 hours. Again, this is very specific to Ontario, but when it occurs, you have to notify the Ministry of Labor inspector. Usually you're going to call them. So in our cases, a lot of times the critical injury is happening to a client. You want to communicate with the client. Have you contact the Ministry of Labor, or shall we contact the Ministry of Labor? Sometimes you're both going to end up doing it. The important thing is you actually make sure you contact the Ministry of Labor. Then you have to conduct an investigation, and within 48 hours, you have to submit a written report to the Minister of Labor. And that's different than any sort of workplace safety and insurance requirements, so any WSIB requirements. Separate report if a critical injury has occurred. We have a scenario to go through. So a new client places an order for a general laborer. It is the final assembly line that wraps and boxes cans of cat food. They will then lift the newly packaged food and put it on a skid. Another worker will use a forklift to pick up the skid when it is full. Customer tells you they run a very safe operation and have won safety awards. Training will be provided around their safety procedures. Safety boots are required and gloves will be provided. After the second week, the employee placed on the assignment tells you that they will not return. They state that the equipment that is used to put plaster wrap on the case of food is blocked and want you to push the product through with your hand using more force. They've also asked that in the absence of a forklift driver, you operate the forklift and move the skids to a designated area. You refused, but the supervisor said everyone does it. Lastly, you burned yourself while packaging and your supervisor told you to be more careful. You do not feel safe and the supervisor intimidates you. So based on that case study, we have a true and false. Please record your answer. You and the customer can discipline your employee for refusing to work. Is that true or false? Very good. So overwhelmingly, most people have answered false. One person, he is entitled to refuse work if it's unsafe. Absolutely. Great answers, everyone. You and your customer are prohibited from penalizing, dismissing, disciplining, suspending, or threatening to do any of these things to a worker who has refused work. If you remember back from the beginning of our discussion today, workers have three basic rights. One of those rights is the right to refuse unsafe work. Ultimately, the workers following the regulations of OSA, and they cannot be penalized for exercising their rights. It's a very important thing to remember. We're going to go through this a little bit more in depthly as well. So what is the right to refuse work? An employee can refuse to work at any time for the following reasons. The physical condition of the workplace or workstation is likely to endanger your employee. Any machine, equipment, or tool that the employee is working, or the physical condition of the workplace is likely to endanger your employee or another worker. It doesn't necessarily have to be the employee. It could be another worker who was facing imminent injury. Or lastly, workplace violence is present and is likely to endanger your employee. So how do we ensure and support our workers when they uncover a safe work environment? And again, we're dealing with a third-party environment here, so it's a little bit different and it doesn't change our requirements, so we need to understand that. First and foremost, though, we need to ensure that our employees undergo mandatory training. We need to ensure that the client site has been inspected to be deemed a safe work environment. And you need to understand what the process is and what needs to be done when a work refusal is in place. So another question, true or false? Will the employee will not be paid while refusing to work. True or false? So read that carefully. The employee will not be paid while they refuse to work. True or false? So most of the answers back are false. Someone has commented that they feel it's a trick question. But Trina, I agree with you. It is a bit of a trick question. It's not my favorite question either on this module. The employee must be paid during the first stage of the work refusal. I will explain what that means in the next slide, but the employee must be paid. During the second stage, the employee may be asked from other work at the customer site or another customer site, but you do want to understand that there are different stages. And again, this is on Ontario, very specific to Ontario, but in the first stage, the employee must be paid. So we're going to take a look at stage one, refusal of work at stage one. Worker must stop working immediately and they must inform the direct supervisor. You can't just say it's unsafe and go home. There are steps that the employee is required to perform. So they stop working immediately, they inform their direct supervisor. Supervisor must then investigate the situation in the presence of another worker or health and safety rep or joint health and safety committee rep. The worker is to remain close to site while the investigation is conducted, again being paid for such time. Upon resolution, the worker must report the incident and their branch representative 24 hours. The employee who is refusing work must remain in a safe place somewhere close to the workstation until the investigation is completed. This interval is known as the first stage of work refusal. The situation resolved at this point, the worker will return to work. Many times the investigation is concluded, the situation is rectified, and the worker can go back immediately. The situation is not rectified, and the investigation moves on to stage 2. What does that mean? Pragmatically, the employee is able to say, I'm using this ladder, one of the rungs is cracked, I don't want to use that ladder. And that would be deemed a work refusal. The supervisor could look at that ladder and say, I see the broken rung, it is cracked, we will get you a new ladder, and promptly gets a new ladder. The employee would then be required to return to their regular duty. That is how it should occur. It can get a little more nuanced, obviously, it can get a little more specific, depending on the refusal, but in a perfect case scenario, problem was identified, it was agreed that there was a problem was fixed, the employee returns to work. If, however, you're unable to conclude that, what you're going to do is proceed to stage 2. The worker still has reasonable grounds to continue believing this still unsafe. They can continue to refuse work on these grounds. The idea is the worker will need to contact a representative. There's a few things you can do in this stage to handle this, and this isn't legal advice, but you want to get past this stage 2. It could be moving the worker to a different area. So perhaps, based on the person's physical size, let's say they are 110 pounds and the job requires them to lift 50-pound bags of flour. That may not be safe for that particular person, and you can move them to a different part of the line where that sort of physical requirement isn't required, and you put someone else that is able to lift a 50-pound bag of flour. That would be an acceptable resolution, as long as the person is not losing money, not losing, any sort of item because they've exercised the right. Generally, though, you want to rectify the situation. You can't just say go back to work or fire them, because that would be against the legislation. If you're unable to resolve it, you're going to hit stage 3. You do not want to be in stage 3, because at stage 3, what happens? The worker is still refusing work because they deem it to be unsafe. You've been unable to alleviate their fear of it being unsafe. And what you need to do is notify the Ministry of Labor or provincial inspector of this work refusal. What this means is now you have the government coming into your client workplace or your workplace potentially, and now they're going to take a look at it. So they're going to look at it and say, okay, you guys are unable to rectify the situation. I will be the final authority in this. And once the inspector is in your workplace, they can go look at anything they want. While they're there, they might as well go look at other work areas. Oftentimes, that's exactly what will happen. You don't want to be in that situation. The inspector could come to the workplace, or they could do this over the phone. They could investigate it. And then a decision is going to be made in writing as to whether the work will endanger the worker. The inspector will decide whether the work is likely to endanger the worker or another person, and the decision will be given to the worker and the customer. If the inspector finds that the work is not likely to endanger the worker is expected to return to work. If, however, they deem it to be unsafe, they can provide an order to the company to fix that, which could be very costly. It could be, a very costly sort of endeavor. You want to do your best to resolve this before you reach stage 3. Now, that's a cautionary tale. I'm not saying how to do this. You have to look at this on a case-by-case basis. You don't want to get to stage 3, though. It's even more important for us as we are not there to monitor on a day-to-day basis the workload or the safety of the work. And we do have to rely on the information provided by the employee as well as the client. If hazards are present, then our role is to ensure that the customer develops and implements safety controls or programs, or it may not be prudent to be doing business with them or providing employees into that specific work area where the work is unsafe. And as a temporary or third-party provider, we do have that ability. We could say, look, move the person, or you could potentially put them at a different work assignment, as long as, the employee is not being penalized for it. So there are a number of options to deal with it. Recommend getting your legal team or HR team or whatever it is you have at your workplace involved at that point, but you don't want to get to this stage. Understand too, again, a work refusal, you do have to follow the processes in place. This is the Ontario rules. Most of the provinces are pretty similar. They may name them different things, but they do have the sort of requirements to fix the issues. Provincial Compensation Act. This is the final part of our course today. We're going to be looking at compensation specific to each province, with more of a hint towards the Ontario Compensation Act, but workers' compensation is pretty similar across the board. Certain nuances will change. I'll kind of highlight those as we go through, but we're going to take a look at that. And one of the things we need to understand as employers, managers, supervisors, workers in government all have responsibilities when it comes to workplace health and safety. Workers have the right to refuse unsafe work, which we just went through. They have the right to participate in health and safety activities and know about the dangers in the workplace. So what is the purpose of the Workplace Safety and Insurance Act? For those of you that don't know, the Workplace Safety and Insurance Act is the act that defines what happens when someone is injured, what we have to do as employers, what healthcare providers have to do, what the employees have to do, what the government has to do. And it's called a no-fault system. So the legislation does not care who is at fault for this. It doesn't really matter. You still have to perform the same functions, and the employee still has access to healthcare and getting better. It has to be a very egregious sort of action. So there's something called horseplay. And so if they're, I don't know, riding on top of a forklift and they've received training that they're not allowed to ride on the top of a forklift and get hurt, you could potentially petition the workers' compensation to stop that claim or say claim's not valid. However, that'll take probably months and months for you to deal with. As a no-fault system, the system doesn't care who is at fault. If it was the employer or the employee, the system still continues. Workplace safety insurance is funded 100% by employers. What this means are that premiums from the employer fund the entire system. There's no sort of tax money. The government doesn't kick in money to it. It's the employers who raise all the money for the system that pays when injured workers or when workers are injured. And therefore there are strong financial and legal implications associated with this. So what is the purpose of the act? It establishes an insurance plan to compensate employees who are injured or disabled to workplace accidents. Ensures whenever possible the successful return to work of employees follows work-related injuries or occupational illness, promotes health and safety in the workplace and reduces injury and disease, and facilitates the return to work and recovery of workers. Injury and loss of work. The Act ensures that employees receive support and healthcare by returning to work in his or her pre-injury position or other suitable work, finding alternative work if the employee or if the injury prevents him or her continuing with the current employer, enables compensation to be paid to the worker when a worker loses earnings or becomes disabled or worker survivors of a fatal injury. When an employee is injured at work or contracts an occupational disease in the course of employment, the Act ensures the employee receives support and healthcare by way of the following: returning the worker in his or her pre-injury position or other suitable work. The work in the pre-injury role may no longer be available or the term has ended. Our role is to look for other suitable work for this worker. So that, I draw your attention to that. So that's more of a management function of the temporary employment agency. It doesn't necessarily mean you have to return them to that specific position. In most cases, in most provinces, you're able to return them to a different position. So they could be hurt at employer A, and you have a little bit lighter work at employer B. You could definitely put that employee there. And since the temporary employment agency is the employer of record, the Workers' Compensation Board most likely will say the work is suitable, that worker has returned to suitable work. It also enables compensation to be paid to the worker when a worker loses earnings or becomes disabled. So what that means is there is a mechanism within the Workplace Safety Insurance Act that if the employee is injured and they're not working, the compensation board will pay them. They will make sure that they receive health care, and they will make sure that they are able to return to the pre-injury position, or they'll receive training otherwise. What that means for us as employers is we are incentivized to participate, A, because we're legally required, but B, because we're financially penalized if a worker is not participating in active return to work. And that's the same across all provinces. There is a financial pressure on the employer to participate in this, as well as the humanistic one and so forth, but understand there's a strong financial penalty if you don't participate. Record keeping is critical. As the employer, you must keep a record of all accidents by the injured worker, and you want some key facts to be in this information. You want the date and time of occurrence, so when did it happen? You want the names of any witnesses, and it's important to do this right at the fact, right when it happens. Get some statements from the witnesses as well if you can, because what happens as time passes, witness stories changes, or they may change jobs and you can't find them anymore. Really important to get that information documented and hopefully get it signed by the witness so you have a historical record of what happened. You want to get information on the nature of the injury, the location of the injury. Location of the injury, what I mean by that is it's really important when it happens. If the worker, say, cuts himself on their right arm, make sure you're noting that. You don't want that location of injury to change later, and that sometimes does happen. You know, a wrist injury turns into an elbow injury, which turns into a shoulder injury. And it could be the passage of time, it could be other mechanisms. You want to make sure you're documenting at the time of the accident what happened and where did it happen to. The details of any first aid treatment given. One of the statements I heard of, way back is if it's not documented, it didn't happen. This is especially the case in workplace safety and health. So when you're investigating any sort of issue, you want to make sure it's documented, make sure it's in writing. Again, what I said earlier, get it signed if necessary. You want that information because that is your proof. You're going to be using that information to provide to the Workers' Compensation Board, especially if there is disagreement on the injury. If there is any sort of appeal in this workplace, a lot of times what happens is the injury happens and you're not dealing with the appeal at the board for 3 years, 4 years, 5 years. All those things are important. And as we all know, 5 years is a long time. Your workplace may be completely different in 5 years. So you want to make sure you have a program in place that when you investigate, you're getting all the information you will hopefully need for the perpetuity of that injury and as you manage it. It's crucial to document details of all the accidents. Even if it doesn't seem serious, you want to make sure you're documenting it because it may become serious. Even in the case of if an employee tells you, you know what, I was playing hockey over the weekend, I got hurt my back, you might want to document that somewhere because if Monday morning they come in and say, oh, I hurt my back at the work site, there could be some relation to the injury that happened over the weekend. Documentation is key. Again, if it's not documented, it didn't happen. Got a multiple choice question here. When there is a critical injury in the workplace, the manager is required to report the injury within 24 to 36 hours of the injury taking place to the safety group, 3 days to workers' compensation, immediately to the Ministry of Labor, 2 days with a written report to the Ministry of Labor, all the above, or F, B, C, D only. Please record your answer. So this question, we got kind of an assortment of answers. We got E's, we got F's, we got C's, we got we got an F here. The best answer in this case is F, which includes B. So critical injury has to be reported within 3 days to workers' comp, immediately to the Ministry of Labor, and then 2 days a written report to the Ministry of Labor. Reporting actions. So if an employee is absent from work or requires healthcare as a result of a workplace accident, the incident must be reported to the WCB within 3 days if your worker loses no time from work, the worker earns less than a regular day's pay, your worker gets outside healthcare treatment. You can wait on reporting the incident for up to 7 days if your worker receives modified work at full pay, your worker needs nothing beyond first aid. So what does this mean? The important thing is, one of the most important things, if your worker loses time from work, or if they get health care, you're going to want to look at submitting it to workers' compensation. Those are kind of the key factors that designate whether or not you have to report to the workers' compensation. It's not a choice if you report it. You don't get to make the decision. If one of those factors happen, they start missing work, they earn less than they do regularly because they're not able to say work 8 hours a day. They're only able to work 2 hours a day, so they're only get paid 2 hours a day. They're losing hours. Or if they go see a healthcare provider, at that point, you are required to submit it to workers' compensation. You do not need to report the incident to workers' compensation in almost all cases if the worker only receives first aid. So if they cut themselves at work, they get a Band-Aid, they take a couple hours in the lunchroom, and then they're able to return to work. It's not a workers' compensation issue. You're still going to want to investigate it. You're still going to want to document it. You don't necessarily have to report it to workers' compensation though. Return to work and the duty to modify work. So when you're considering modified work, consider how it will support the injured worker. It has to be achievable, safe, constructive, and productive. What does this mean? So in some of the cases where a worker is injured, especially in our cases where we're not in care and control of the workplace, we have to be creative in return to work opportunities. They could be at the client, they could be within our office, they could be at another client. Again, I mentioned earlier, there's a financial incentive for us to participate in return to work, because if they are not working, if they're not being paid by the employer, the Workers' Compensation Board will remunerate them. If they're doing so, they are charging, again, it's 100% funded by employers, they will be charging your company extra money. So they again, it's financially creative or financially imperative that you're being a participant in the return to work. What does this modified work mean? It has to be achievable. When work is achievable, we help to provide confidence to the worker, as well as ensuring the work is achieved based on the worker's injury and any limitations. So they have to be able to actually get the work done. You don't want to be setting standards where they because of the injury, there's no way they will be able to achieve the work of themselves. It has to be safe. We want to continue to keep all our workers safe. It has to be a key component when workers are returning or you're modifying work for them. By safe, it means following the doctor's advice, some sort of functional abilities, information. You want to ensure that they're not going to injure themselves further by returning to modified work. It has to be constructive. So you want to look for work that, although it may be modified, it is contributing to their skill and it's helping them return to their full accountabilities prior to injury. It has to be productive. You want it to be productive and contribute to the overall success of the organization. Those two things, constructive and productive. You don't want to have them sitting in the lunchroom watching Netflix all day. That's not constructive, nor is it productive. They're accomplishing nothing. You're essentially penalizing them for being injured. And if they make a complaint to the Workers' Compensation Board, you, the employer, will be fined or some sort of other judgment will be granted against you. They have to be doing work. It doesn't necessarily have to be the exact work they were doing. You are able to modify the work, but it has to fall within the parameters of being achievable, safe, constructive, and productive. Let me take a look at this case study. In a manufacturing plant, coworkers were unaware that an employee of 6 years was inside the oven when they loaded multiple carts, collectively containing about 12,000 pounds of tuna. Closed the door and started the oven. The victim inadvertently became trapped in the back of a superheated pressurized steam cooker. The process was 2 hours in duration and the temperatures rose to 270 degrees. Charges were raised against were laid against a former safety manager and the director of plant operations, carrying a possible jail term of 3 years and a fine of $250,000. And he faces up to $1.5 million if convicted. Now, there isn't a specific example on this. What this does highlight, though, is there is a duality of responsibility. And here in Canada, we actually have, so executives of the company could be held criminally negligent for this. So in this case, the safety manager, CEO could be held criminally negligent for the actions of the company, or rather the inactions of the company. So in this case, where the employee was involved in a fatal accident where they did die, more than likely this company would be fined, they would be charged. And if this was here in Canada, very possible that the executive, CEO or what have you, whoever's the most senior person, could be held criminally negligent for this incident. And so, again, we just wanted to draw your attention to some of the repercussions. We as employers, we don't get to, as temporary employment agencies, we don't get to duck under the cover of the client. We can't just say, well, it's the client that did it. The government will still take a look at the temporary employment agency. They will still be part of the investigation because they are the employer of record, and they could still be held liable for any of these things. So they could be still held liable for a case like this. Whether they would be held to the full extent as the clients, hard to say. But you will definitely be involved in that sort of investigation. So I draw your attention to this not to concern you, but just to make sure that we understand, again, we have responsibilities for health and safety, especially in the workplace, regardless of the circumstances. So we're going to move on. We're able to skip this section. We're not going to delve into Alberta specific today. Lastly, what we have here are some links for learners, they're called. Essentially, every provincial compensation board, we have the link here. This will be part of your handout that you received this weekend, or this week rather. Every board has a lot of safety information. BC is great for videos. They have a lot of good videos. Ontario's coming up. They have a lot of good, like, young and new worker videos that they've been putting out. A lot of good safety information. If you are operating in any of these provinces, likely you are, obviously, you're going to want to take a look, go through there, see what sort of information they have, especially if you're new to the workforce, new to temporary employment, or new to the workforce itself. Going through some of these work sites will help you understand a little bit of, what it is that workers' compensation is, and the sort of repercussions that we have if we're not compliant, if we don't have a good health and safety system, if our management system isn't dealing with hazards in the workplace. And lastly, we have a couple good resources. So the first one is the Canadian Centre for Occupational Safety and Health, CCOHS. They're very good. I use them quite a bit, actually, if you're looking for specific safety information. So if you're doing up, say, job descriptions and the person is, I don't know, they're working on some specific machines, or let's say they're just shoveling. There's information on just simple things like shoveling on that site. So if you're looking up information on proper safety protocols within your safety program, or even, again, just job descriptions, great site, recommend it. Ministry of Labor within the jurisdiction. In Ontario, it's separate. Ministry of Labor and WCIB is separate. And some of the other provinces, they're together. Look for that information. Lastly, if you are operating, obviously you're an ACSESS member, if you have some questions or concerns, you're able to contact ACSESS, you're able to ask them questions. They may not know the exact answer, but they may help guide you in the area that you may need. I'd share that with your team member. That's one of the benefits of being a member of ACSESS, is having that sort of shared resource. Again, especially because we are temporary employment agencies, we're operating all together. We're all operating. We have generally the same sort of challenges. ACSESS is a great resource. I recommend reaching out to them. They have a lot of information. They have safety groups and so forth. So I recommend reaching out to them. Lastly, that's the end of the module today. If you have any questions, definitely recommend reaching out to ACSESS. They will be able to guide you in the right directions. I do wish everyone success in challenging the CPC exam. Hopefully everyone's going to write it very soon. It's a little more tricky. I do recommend studying for it though, but I'm sure all of you will do very well. So anyways, I just want to say thank you, and that concludes the presentation today.
Thanks, Dave.
Take care.
Hi, David. I have a question for you.
Sure.
Yeah, I'm so sorry. I missed about 3 minutes of the first of what you said, and I'm not sure for the exam. Do we have to sign up, or how does it work for the exam? I'm so sorry.
Yeah, I don't deal that. Jennifer is likely the person that sent you the original information. Reach out to her. You should have probably got an email that gives you like what to do. But from been doing this a long time, setting up our staff members for it. So you write the exam, you'll be given a link, and you'll have a set number of hours. I think it's like 4 hours maybe to do it, and you have to complete it within that period of time. It's multiple choice as far as I know. But I would definitely reach out to Jennifer and find out if you haven't received the email what to do.
All right, great. Well, thank you so much.
No problem. All right, if there's no further questions, take care, everyone.
See ya.
Yeah.
Hi, sorry, I have a question.
Oh, sure.
This Alberta part, is it going to be a part of the exam or not?
No, it's not.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for everything.
Everything I've probably repeated it twice if you need it on the exam. So everything that we've gone through, you have.
Okay, thank you.
Take care.
Thank you, David. Have a good day.